I woke up with my fingers covered in ink and with a sentence written on my own wall. Keep writing, or I will write with your body. The problem is that handwriting was mine, but I didn't write it. My name is Lucas, and if you're hearing this, I need you to pay attention until the end. This story is not fiction. It's not a legend. It's a warning. Something is using my mind, and maybe now it's looking through your eyes too. Before I continue, I just ask one thing. If you like stories that keep you from sleeping, that make you doubt your own memory, subscribe to this channel now. But not because I want you to. Do it because maybe, just maybe, it's the only way to prove you're still in control of your mind. Ready? Because after today, you'll start to notice words you never wrote, sentences that appear on their own, voices only you can hear. And it all began with the silence in my apartment. My apartment was small. 2 rooms, walls damp with humidity, a constant smell of stale coffee and mold. After I got fired from the magazine, I cut everything off. TV, phone, people, anything that made too much noise, anything that distracted me from my plan to write. I always thought silence would help. But what I found was a silence that listened. I spent my days locked in, buried in drafts and crumpled notebooks. I had a fixed idea: to write horror stories, dark, disturbing things that messed with the reader's mind. And at first, it worked. The words came easily, as if they were already written. Sometimes I just had to touch the pen to the paper, and the story flowed on its own. But then one night, while reviewing one of my texts, I noticed a sentence in the middle of the paragraph, a sentence I didn't remember writing. It was subtle, like someone leaving a note, correcting my style, a critique. But in my handwriting, I thought I was just tired, until it happened again. Twice, 3 times, 10 times, and not just in one notebook. I started finding messages on scrap paper, on the backs of receipts, in the margins of books. And they all had one thing in common. They were written by me, but they didn't come from me. At first, I tried to rationalize. It had to be memory lapses, sleepwalking. Or maybe I was writing in a trance, like those artists who enter a creative flow. But the messages started to change. At first, they were just style corrections, suggestions. Then, they started calling me by name. Lucas, this is weak. You can do better. Then, Lucas, keep going. Write more. Don't stop now. And then came the first threat. It was written in red ink at the bottom of a blank page. Keep writing, or I will write with your body. I froze for minutes. That handwriting was perfectly mine. I tried to tear the paper. I burned it. The next day, the sentence reappeared, written on the bathroom mirror, with toothpaste. That was the night the dreams started. A dark hallway with torn pages scattered on the floor. A dragging, wet sound coming from somewhere behind me. I ran, but the floor was made of damp paper, sticking to my feet. And when I fell, something reached me. It was a creature made of black ink, stitched together with rusted staples and whispered voices. It leaned over me and said, "You are the channel. I am the story." I woke up gasping, with the notebook on my lap. In it, a new story, written by me. But I swear, I didn't write a single word. I tried to forget, closed the notebooks, threw away the pens, stopped. But something inside me insisted. A need, a hunger. Like my mind was in pain whenever I didn't write. And that's when reality started obeying. I wrote a short story about a car accident, just an exercise. A random story, no names, no specific details. The next day, I saw the news. A truck had crashed into a car on the exact stretch of road I had described. The details were identical. The car's plate, the time. I thought it was coincidence, until I wrote about an old man dying alone upstairs, and heard, that same day, the paramedics climbing the stairs of my building. The man from apartment 302, dead. Alone. With each new text, more coincidences. People I'd never seen saying phrases I had written. Exact phrases. I was losing control. Or maybe I never had it. I decided to test it. I wrote a love story. Harmless. Nothing happened. Then I wrote one about a woman who vanished at the market. The next day, I saw the posters. Missing. Vanessa disappeared yesterday. I never knew her name, but it was there in my story, written by me, or by whatever is using my hand. I had to understand where it was coming from. The messages, the dreams, the coincidences. That's when I remembered the library at the end of the street. An old building, bricks darkened by time, always locked, windows boarded up. No one went in, no one came out. But on a cloudy morning, the door was ajar. The light inside was yellow, lifeless. The floor covered in dust and loose pages. At the back of the room, I found a fallen shelf. Behind it, an old safe. No lock, just a mechanism that required a word. Without thinking, I wrote, "Veil." The safe opened. Inside, there was a single notebook. Worn leather, stained pages. The first line, "The ink is the flesh of the sleeping gods." The author, Anton Veil. I searched the name and found out. He was a forgotten writer from the 1920s, known for texts that drove readers insane. He disappeared in 1921 after publishing his final story, a story about a writer being controlled by invisible forces through writing. His handwriting was identical to mine, and the last sentence in the notebook read, "If you're reading this, it's already found you." That's when I understood. I wasn't writing stories. I was giving voice to something that should never be heard. After the library, everything got worse. I tried to stop. Really. Locked all the notebooks, threw away the pens, turned off the computer. I went 2 whole days without writing a single word. But on the 3rd morning, I woke up with pain in my hands. The pain of repetitive strain, like I had spent the whole night typing. And when I went to the office, the papers were filled. 5 pages with dialogues, descriptions, even full paragraphs, all in my handwriting. But I didn't write any of it. I installed a camera. The next night, I slept on the couch. In the morning, more pages were written. I went back to watch the video. At 3 in the morning, I got up like a puppet, eyes open, blank expression. I sat at the table, picked up the pen, and wrote for 3 hours straight. But that wasn't what scared me. It was the moment when I stopped. I looked straight at the camera and smiled. Not a normal smile. It was cynical, cold, as if that thing was watching me from inside. At that moment, I understood I was no longer being influenced. I was being used, and my mind was just the entryway. I knew I was lost, but I still had a chance. If everything I wrote became real, then maybe I could write the end, an ending where everything was over, where the protagonist destroyed himself and took the parasite down with him. It was risky, but it was that, or be completely erased by what lived inside me. I opened a new notebook, wrote like I had never written before. The story was direct, raw. A man who descends into his own mind, finds the parasite, and sacrifices himself to keep it from reaching others. While I wrote, the house shook. Books fell off the shelves on their own. Pages floated in the air, spiraling around me. Strange sounds came from the walls, as if someone or something was scratching the concrete from the inside. I kept writing, even with burning eyes, even with bleeding hands, until the final sentence. And then Lucas stopped writing forever. I dropped the pen, took a deep breath. The house stopped shaking. An absolute silence fell over everything. For a moment, I thought I had won. But the silence was familiar. The same silence from when it all began. The silence that fell over the apartment wasn't a sign of peace. It was a trap, a suffocating vacuum that locked me in a world with no way out. My breathing sounded like thunder in the empty room. Every sound, every shadow seemed to multiply into infinite echoes. Then, without warning, something changed in the air. The temperature dropped suddenly, chilling my bones, as if an invisible presence had entered through a door I never saw open. The walls, once cold and still, began to pulse, as if they had a dark heart, beating slowly, heavily, in sync with the fear growing inside me. A whisper emerged from the shadows, an ancient voice, burdened with centuries, saying my name with terrifying certainty, an invitation to the abyss. I tried to move, run, scream, but my legs were made of lead. My words stuck in a dry throat. The pen I had left on the table came to life. It slid across the paper on its own, scribbling lines that didn't belong to my mind, but to something much older. You are not the author. You are part of the story. I watched, hypnotized and terrified, as the unfamiliar handwriting took shape before my eyes, as if that text was the true ritual of my downfall. The voice in my head grew louder, turning into a symphony of madness and despair, an orchestra that commanded every fiber of my being. That was when I realized I was never the owner of the pen. I was just its tip, an instrument for something much greater, an entity that exists beyond time, that dreams, manipulates, and writes through our lives. And now, it was awakening. Days after that nightmare became routine. Something unexpected happened. A mysterious blog appeared on the internet, constantly updated with texts I hadn't written or didn't remember writing. Each story was more disturbing than the last. Each word pulsed with a dark energy that seemed to suck the air from around it. At the end of the last post, one message stood out, written in blood-red letters on the screen. Thank you for continuing to read. Now it's you who writes for me. I wanted to warn you, the viewer who made it this far. This story doesn't end with me. It has chosen you. Subscribe. Stay alert. Because at any moment, the pen might start moving on its own in your hand, and you might be the next story written, not by you, but by something that wants to exist through your voice, your mind, your very flesh. I tried to escape this fate, but the pen never stops. And you? Will you let it write your story? Story 2. The speaker that whispered forbidden secrets. On the first night, the speaker began crackling with a sequence of numbers. At first, I thought it was just static, regular radio interference. But when I wrote down those coordinates and checked the map, I realized they pointed to a place no one knows. On the second night, the static gave way to a whispering voice that called my name. Lucas. The word cut through the silence of my room like a knife. On the third night, it wasn't just a voice. It was a scream, a call that shook me to my core. And the next day, I found out that someone had gone missing in that same area. A body never found. My name is Lucas. I'm a sound technician. And if you're hearing this, I need you to listen carefully. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't just a horror story. It's a warning. What started as a strange old radio found in an abandoned shop turned into a real nightmare. Something is using that speaker to open a door to something that shouldn't exist, and I'm the only one who can stop it. But before I continue, I want you to do something right now. If you enjoy stories that mess with your mind, keep you up at night, that make you look over your shoulder when you're alone, subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell, because this story will keep you hooked until the end, and maybe change the way you see the world forever. Are you ready? Then come with me, because the frequency of this speaker isn't for just anyone. It's for those who know how to hear what's hidden in the shadows. It all started on a rainy afternoon, when the city felt like a gray, suffocating maze. I, Lucas, worked as a sound technician in studios, events, and small productions. It was a repetitive routine, always dealing with noises, microphones, and that eternal quest for the perfect frequency. But that day, something caught my eye in the abandoned shop on Franklin Street, a place everyone avoided. Among dust and forgotten objects, something shined. An old tube radio, covered in rust and mold, almost hidden in a pile of junk. The radio seemed out of place, as if it had been left there just to be found. Without thinking much, I took it home. I turned on the device with an anxiety I couldn't explain. The radio growled, crackled, and suddenly static filled the room. At first, just confusing noises, hissing. But when night fell, the radio began emitting a sequence of numbers, long combinations that looked like geographic coordinates. I got curious and wrote everything down. The next morning, I checked the map. To my surprise, those coordinates pointed to a remote area outside the city, an unnamed place on regular maps, an abandoned industrial zone. What was an old, rusty radio trying to show me? The question consumed me, but routine couldn't wait. I went back to work, but I couldn't get the device out of my head. That night, the static turned into a voice, a faint whisper, almost imperceptible, repeating my name. Lucas. The word seeped into my mind, like an invitation or a warning. I wanted to turn off the radio, but I couldn't. It was like an invisible force held my arm. Researching, I found old stories of devices picking up signals from beyond. Things no one was supposed to hear. Messages from forgotten cults, entities crossing dimensions. That night was only the beginning of something that would surpass everything I could imagine. The radio wasn't a regular device. It was a door, a forbidden unfrequency, a channel between worlds, and I was trapped by it. Something told me the worst was yet to come, but at that moment, all I could do was wait and listen, and try to understand what that voice wanted from me. After that first night, nothing went back to normal. The radio seemed to take on a life of its own. On the second night, the sequence of numbers gave way to fragments of words, noises, mixed with almost unintelligible whispers that made my skin crawl. I tried to record the transmissions, but whenever I checked the recordings, the sounds had vanished or changed inexplicably. It was as if it didn't want to be captured by regular devices. The third night brought the worst. The voice, now clearer and closer, whispered my name more times. Lucas, with a disturbing insistence. It didn't seem human. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, a call. That night, I began to notice strange phenomena in my apartment. Flickering lights, the air growing heavy, shadows moving where no light source existed. My sanity began to waver, and the line between reality and delusion grew thinner and thinner. For several nights, the radio wouldn't stop. It wasn't just static or disconnected voices. They were messages, threatening phrases, obscure instructions, warnings of something I couldn't understand. You cannot run. They are coming. Prepare to hear the truth. I didn't know who or what those messages came from, but the fear was real, pulsing in my chest like a frantic drum. I began writing everything down, every noise, every word, every silence. I researched old records, reports of disappearances, and cults that used radios to communicate with the beyond. Everything seemed connected, but no one believed me. My friends distanced themselves. The police dismissed everything as paranoia. I was alone, trapped in an invisible web the radio was weaving around me. One night, as I tried to turn off the device, an invisible force stopped me. The radio emitted a high-pitched scream that made my ears throb and my heart nearly stop. From that moment, I understood I wasn't just a spectator. I was at the center of something much larger, an ancient, dark, and dangerous plot. The radio's frequency didn't just transmit sounds. It sent an invitation to something beyond human comprehension. And I had no choice but to keep listening, because even if I wanted to run, it had already found me. The messages from the radio started to make sense, or rather, they pointed to something I never imagined. The coordinates I received weren't random. They were precise locations tied to recent disappearances, people vanishing without a trace, a woman, a young man, an elderly man, all connected by these nighttime calls. I started cross-referencing data, digging into old news and police records, until I found a disturbing pattern. The victims were all near the areas marked by the radio. I tried to alert the police. "Sir, these stories are nothing but coincidence," they said. "You're clinging to fantasies." My friends, upon hearing what I was saying, pulled away, looking at me with a mix of pity and fear. Alone, I began to realize the radio wasn't just a device. It was a key piece of a game I didn't fully understand. One night, I received a different message, a direct instruction. Go to the place. See with your own eyes. The place was the abandoned zone from the initial coordinates, the forgotten industrial area. I hesitated, but the voice on the radio left me no choice. It was a call I felt deep in my chest, an urgency impossible to ignore. When I arrived, silence dominated, but the air felt heavy, dense, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. Remains of collapsed structures, strange graffiti on the walls, symbols that looked human-made but didn't belong to this world. As I walked, I felt watched. I heard footsteps, whispers, distant voices I couldn't understand. At one point, I found recent traces, personal objects, marks on the ground, signs of struggle. Fear froze me, but an invisible force pushed me forward. I knew the radio was the key to uncovering what was happening, but I also knew that the deeper I went, the farther I'd drift from my own sanity. I was trapped between what I saw and what I felt, between reality and the unknown. And more, I felt that forbidden frequency wasn't just a sound. It was an invitation to enter a world where nothing was what it seemed, and where true horror was still to come. I decided I had to understand what was really going on. I could no longer ignore the signs, the voices, the disappearances. I started looking for clues, old documents, forgotten accounts that might tie everything together. That's how I found references to a cult no one mentioned, an obscure sect that had existed in the city's shadows since the 1920s. They believed in an ancient entity, an invisible force that could cross dimensions and manipulate reality. The radio I had wasn't a regular radio. It was an artifact they used to communicate with this presence, to open doors between worlds. The texts I found, written in yellowed diaries and newspaper clippings, spoke of rituals, sacrifices, and a forbidden frequency that bridged our world and the unknown. The more I read, the more the line between reason and madness blurred. I asked old residents, but many refused to talk, as if they feared the words would summon something. Others simply denied the cult's existence, calling it an urban legend. But I knew there was truth there. One day, I received a new message over the radio. This time, not just a whisper, but a clear command. They're coming to finish what they started. That same night, I began to notice strange figures on the streets, shadows moving against the light, whispers in the wind. I was being watched, and the cult didn't want me investigating. They wanted to silence me, or worse. Paranoia took over. Every sound, every unusual movement felt like a threat, I knew I had to act fast, but it felt like I was sinking into a nightmare with no way out. And all because that cursed radio kept talking. It kept calling me into something I might not even understand or escape from. I tried to destroy the radio. That was my mistake. I grabbed a hammer and struck with all my strength, hoping the device would break into pieces, and with it, all the terror it brought. But the radio didn't break. The moment the hammer touched the casing, it turned on by itself, emitting a high-pitched screech that seemed to tear at my soul. The lights in the house flickered frantically, as if reacting to that sonic scream, and a sense of paralysis took hold of my body. The radio tuned itself, emitting sounds that didn't belong to this world. A mix of voices, distorted screams, and an almost hypnotic rhythm. I tried to move, to scream, but nothing came out of my mouth. In that moment, I understood the radio had a will of its own, that it wasn't just a channel, but a being, or an extension of an entity trying to manifest. In the days that followed, the phenomena worsened. Electronics failed, objects vanished, and reappeared in other places, and the voices on the radio became clearer and more aggressive. I was losing control of my own home, of my mind. I started seeing shadows on the walls, shapes twisting and watching me with invisible eyes. Each night, the radio screamed louder, and I felt that something was coming, something that couldn't be stopped. The presence behind the radio was closer, and I was the channel. And deep down, I knew the battle for my soul was just beginning. The coordinates the radio transmitted were an invitation or a sentence. That rainy night, I followed the call, driven by a mix of fear and determination. I arrived at the abandoned industrial zone, a place forgotten by the city and by light itself. The air was heavy, filled with a strange, metallic, damp smell. Shadows danced between the collapsed structures, and each step echoed in deadly silence. Suddenly, among the rubble, I saw hooded figures gathered in a circle. Voices murmured ancient chants, words in tongues that didn't belong to this world. At the center of the circle, an improvised altar, adorned with symbols that seemed to pulse with their own light, a dark and hypnotic light. The ritual I witnessed was horrific and magnificent at the same time, a summoning of something beyond human comprehension. My heart pounded erratically, and fear threatened to paralyze me. The radio in my pocket gave one final warning, a voice that now sounded like a command. You must choose. Close the door, or let it open. I knew what was at stake. The entity they were trying to awaken was an ancient nightmare, a primordial horror that could devour not just our reality, but everything we know. I had to act. But how? The hooded figures saw me. The hunt had begun. And in that instant, I realized my decision wouldn't affect just me, but the fate of everyone. The tension was unbearable. The line between light and darkness narrowed with every second. I was about to face the greatest terror of my life, and there was no turning back. Before that circle of shadows and ancient whispers, I felt the crushing pressure of the impossible. The radio still vibrated in my pocket, pulsing as if it were alive, insisting on that terrible choice. I could try to close the door, which meant facing the entity, risking my sanity and my life to stop that horror from spreading. Or I could run, save myself, and let the world pay the price. For a moment, fear almost took over. But then, a spark of courage, or madness, lit inside me. I couldn't let that nightmare consume everything. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of fate on my shoulders. The entity began to manifest, an indescribable presence, a shadow that bent reality around itself. The hooded figures raised their hands, chanting in a tone that seemed to tear the fabric of time and space. With the radio in hand, I prepared for whatever was necessary. The forbidden frequency began to pulse strongly, the static turning into a voice that pierced my soul. Then, I screamed against the silence of the abyss, against the darkness that threatened to swallow me. I tried to close the door with everything I had, fighting the feeling of being consumed by that void. It was a battle of will, of existence. With each second, I felt the entity trying to pull me beyond the veil, to a place where time doesn't exist, and madness is eternal. But I resisted. With one final effort, the presence retreated, the circle broke, and a deep silence fell over the place. I was exhausted, hurt, but alive. At least for now. I knew that door could open again, that the fight was far from over. But at that moment, for the first time, I felt I could make a difference, that I wasn't just a victim. I was a guardian, and the war against the unknown had only just begun. I returned home, exhausted, feeling the weight of everything I had experienced. I thought the battle was over, that the worst was behind me. But it wasn't like that. Days later, a mysterious package arrived at my door. Inside, the radio, intact, silent, but with a weak frequency, almost imperceptible, ready to whisper again. I was not alone. A message appeared on my computer screen. a blog I had never created, with disturbing texts I didn't remember writing. Each word carried a dark energy, as if those stories were written by something using my mind as a channel. At the end of the last post, a phrase appeared, in red letters that seemed to pulse. "Thank you for continuing to listen. Now, you write for me." That's when I understood. The cycle had not ended. The entity was not stopped. And the radio, that portal, had found a new guardian. Maybe it's you. If you've made it this far, pay attention. Subscribe to the channel. Share this story. Because what you just heard isn't just a tale, it's an invitation. An invitation to listen to the voices whispering in the shadows, and to decide if you will be the next to write the story, or if you will run away from it forever. The radio is waiting, and it knows your name. Story 3. When the city whispers, the secret that gave voice to the dead. They say silence is the true sound of fear. But that night, in the abandoned city subway, there was no silence. There were whispers, voices filled with something I couldn't understand, calling my name in the dark. Right behind me, I was there for a routine report, or so I thought. I needed to understand why, in recent weeks, strange reports had been increasing. People hearing voices in desolate alleys, unexplained disappearances, and a growing fear that seemed to infect the city. The decommissioned subway was the epicenter of these stories, and no one dared enter after nightfall. That's when I heard the first whisper, a voice so soft it almost seemed part of the wind, but impossible to ignore. "You shouldn't be here." I slowly turned, looking into the void, but there was no one, only the echo of my own ragged breathing, mixed with the distant sound of rain hitting the rusty tracks. At that moment, the whole city seemed to hold its breath. It was as if something ancient and invisible was awakening in the shadows, ready to feed on the fear that filled the air. I knew I should leave, run away as fast as possible. But a part of me, deeper and more dangerous, pushed me to keep going. The truth, I thought, is always where fear lives. But that night wasn't just a casual encounter with the unknown. It was the beginning of something that would change everything. Something I could never have imagined. A door opened to a world our human minds should never conceive. As the voices grew, echoing through the empty tunnels, I realized it wasn't just my sanity at stake. It was the city itself, and maybe even the world. If you like stories that penetrate the mind, that explore what lies beyond our understanding, then stay with me until the end. Because what I'm about to tell isn't just a horror story. It's a dive into what has haunted us since time immemorial. And if you're not part of this channel yet, now is the time to subscribe and turn on notifications. Get ready to enter with me into the darkest side of the unknown. But back to that night, as I walked through the dark subway corridors, every step seemed to amplify the whisper, as if the walls were alive, breathing a forgotten language. I couldn't know that at that moment I was crossing an invisible line, a border between what is real and what is eternal. And then, just as my flashlight flickered, I heard again, this time closer, almost in my ear. They are here. The air grew heavy. My heart raced. And that was when everything started to crumble. This city, with its bright lights and busy streets during the day, hides a past few know. Beneath the concrete and asphalt, in forgotten labyrinths, ancient stories remain buried, waiting to be awakened. The abandoned subway where I was not just a station forgotten by time. Decades ago, reports began to emerge about mysterious disappearances, people vanishing without a trace. The police never found convincing explanations, and the media quickly buried the cases, labeling them as common disappearances. But in the city's underworld, people still whisper about ancient cults and forbidden rituals. Long ago, before the city grew, native tribes believed certain areas of the land were tuned with other dimensions, natural portals to the unknown. And over the centuries, these portals were marked by events that defy any human logic. What I had started to investigate was not just a series of strange events. It was an open door to something ancestral, something that refused to stay asleep. Despite progress and modernity, the city carries deep scars, old buildings that refuse to fall, streets that seem to breathe at night, shadows that move where shadows shouldn't be. And the abandoned subway was the epicenter of this mystery. Its dark tunnels, distant echoes, and rusty tracks created an atmosphere that chilled anyone to the bone. My mission was clear: to understand what was happening, to give voice to these forgotten stories, and, if possible, to reveal the truth behind the voices whispering in the dark. I was a skeptical journalist, used to searching for rational explanations. But something in that city was challenging me in ways I could never have imagined. As I delved deeper, I realized the line between reality and the supernatural began to blur. What many considered mere urban legends was starting to take shape before my eyes. But curiosity has a price, and what I was about to discover would not only change my life, but could change everything we know about the world we live in. When I began my investigation, I quickly realized there was more than just simple stories of disappearances or voices that seemed like cruel jokes. It was real and terrifying. Witnesses reported not just whispers, but voices coming from all around, as if the very air was speaking, calling their names, bringing back forgotten memories and ancient fears. I myself began to feel something strange, tiny tremors on my skin, chills that wouldn't go away, the sensation of being watched by something invisible. That led me to a disturbing discovery. The abandoned subway, in its forgotten tunnels, hid a portal to another dimension, a place where ancient entities, beings who live off darkness and human fear, awaited their chance to cross over. These creatures, unlike anything we know, were not just monsters. They were manifestations of collective fear, forces that transcend time and space. By opening this portal, whether by accident or a greater force, we ceased to be the only inhabitants of the city. I saw evidence of this, traces on the walls, marks not made by human hands, sounds impossible to explain. And worst of all, these entities were not just watching. They were acting, attacking people, spreading terror and madness. My search for the truth turned into a fight for survival. Every step I took brought me closer to these forces that seemed to want to consume everything around them. And to make matters worse, the more fear people felt, the stronger these creatures became. The city was slowly being consumed by a shadow that fed on panic and the darkness of the human soul. I had to find a way to close that portal before it was too late. But to do so, I would have to face not only the unknown, but my own fears. As I advanced, what were once scattered stories began to take form, and the city started to change before my eyes. The voices were no longer isolated whispers. They became a constant chorus of despair and madness. People began disappearing en masse, leaving behind only distorted shadows that wandered the streets like hungry specters. Friends, neighbors, strangers. No one was safe. I myself felt the pressure. At night, the shadow creatures would come close, not necessarily to physically attack, but to invade the mind, to corrode sanity. I saw, heard, and felt things I couldn't explain, and that began to change who I was. Fear took over the city like an incurable disease. The streets, once full of life, became corridors of despair. Lights flickered, sounds distorted, and the feeling of being hunted was constant. Amid all this, I tried to find allies, people who also felt the presence of these entities, who had not succumbed to madness. But even they were changing, becoming more distant, more shadowed. My own thoughts began to turn against me. Memories scrambled. Voices inside my head whispered doubts and fears I had never faced before. I discovered these creatures were not just external beings. They fed on the deepest parts of each of us, our inner fears, our forgotten traumas, our darkest shadows. The city felt like a massive mental prison where the line between reality and hallucination disappeared. And at the center of that prison was the subway, where the portal continued to radiate its evil influence. I felt that at any moment I could lose everything: my sanity, my humanity, my very life. But running away was not an option. If no one faced whatever was coming, we would all be doomed. Every encounter with the entities was a trial by fire, a struggle to keep my mind intact as they tried to pull me into an abyss of endless madness. It was as if the city itself was becoming a living organism, pulsating with darkness, with the monsters of the night roaming freely. And I was the only one still believing I could do something to stop it. But how long would I last before being consumed completely? On a stormy night, amidst the growing chaos, I discovered something that changed everything. Among old documents and forgotten stories, I unearthed the truth about my own family, a secret no one should ever know. My lineage was linked to an ancient cult, a group that, centuries ago, sealed the portal to that dark dimension. They were silent guardians, maintaining the balance between worlds. But the seal had weakened, and what had awakened that night in the subway was a direct result of that weakening, which meant that I, unknowingly, carried a responsibility beyond my own life. To close the portal, a sacrifice was necessary, a sacrifice tied to the bloodline, a surrender none of them had made before. I found myself facing a terrible dilemma. Saving the city meant giving up everything, perhaps even my own life. For hours, I battled fear and doubt. I thought about running away, denying this heritage. But I couldn't. Not after everything I had seen, after all I had lost. I was the last hope. If I failed, not only the city, but the entire world could be swallowed by the darkness that escaped from that portal. And even with terror eating away at my mind, I knew I had to face whatever came, no matter the cost. The line between hero and victim was thin, and I was about to cross it. In the heavy silence of the abandoned subway, I knew there was no turning back. Shadows grew enormous around me. Indescribable monsters emerged from the walls, their eyes glowing with an ancient hunger. Every step I took reverberated like a war drum against the impending end. The air was thick, with a putrid smell, a mixture of fear and despair. As I prepared for the ritual that could seal this nightmare forever, my breath was heavy. Every heartbeat seemed to mark the final moment. The creatures advanced in waves, their twisted forms contorting in silent screams. I could feel their presence invading my mind, whispering doubts, feeding my madness. It was a battle not just physical, but spiritual. With trembling hands, I began the ritual, ancient, forbidden words leaving my mouth, invoking forces I barely understood, but that could be the last hope. Tension rose. The space seemed to close in as the portal vibrated around us. The real world and the unknown merged into terrifying chaos. At a critical moment, I thought all was lost. The shadows almost consumed me. My strength failed, but a spark of courage pushed me to continue. The sacrifice I would make would be total. At the peak of the confrontation, reality seemed to shatter. Light and darkness clashed in a grotesque spectacle. And then, a deadly silence. The portal began to close slowly, pulling the entities back into the darkness from which they came. Exhausted and wounded, I felt the weight of what I had done. I knew nothing would ever be the same again. The silence that followed felt like a relief, but there was something strange in the air, a heavy sensation, as if the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for the next exhale. The door to that dark dimension was apparently closed. The subway became empty again, and the night reclaimed its cloak of normality, at least on the surface. But when I woke up the next day, I realized the voices had not disappeared. They now whispered inside me, invading my mind with an intensity I could not control. The horror was no longer out there in the city's shadows. It had settled inside me, an invisible curse that could not be expelled. I was the guardian of a secret that could never be revealed, and perhaps the very living door to the unknown. As the city continued its routine, I knew the true nightmare had only just begun. Because when the city whispers, sometimes it's your own heart that answers. If you enjoyed this story and want to uncover even more dark mysteries like this one, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Get ready. The horrors that inhabit the human mind are just the beginning.